Good evening and welcome to Talk of the Stacks. I'm Christy Pearson with Friends of the Hennepin County Library. Now, for those of you joining us for the first time, Talk of the Stacks is a free author lecture series produced by Friends with guest authors who focus on the craft of writing across a broad array of topics and genres. Tonight, we are continuing our 2022 season with Resmaa Menakem, the best-selling author of My Grandmother's Hands, who joins us to talk about his latest release, The Quaking of America. But first, on behalf of the library and friends, we would like to begin tonight with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that in Hennepin County, we live and work on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Dakota people. This land and the Dakota people belong together. And by offering this land acknowledgement, we commit to supporting and recognizing Indigenous nations and to holding ourselves accountable to the work of reconciliation. Thank you. Well, I would next like to acknowledge our wonderful sponsors who help make this free series possible. Many thanks to the Star Tribune, LSC Architects, and NOR companies for their generosity. During tonight's program, we are continuing our community's conversation with questions surrounding anti-racist education and practices. Our hope is that thought-provoking discussions like these will foster self-reflection and personal growth. We at Friends are proud to support further resources offered by Hennepin County Library, including the Mary Ann Key Book Club, which returns this fall with programming based around Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower. We invite you to click the link in the chat to learn more. And finally, I have just a couple of tips to pass along to help you enjoy tonight's virtual experience. If you would like captions, you can click on the up arrow next to closed captioning icon and select Show Subtitles. And if you would like to ask our author a question, you can log that question at any time using the Q&A icon. And now, here to introduce tonight's special guests is Ayana Muada, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Manager and Consultant for Hennepin County Library. Welcome, Ayana. It's wonderful to see you again, and I hope you all enjoy tonight's conversation.
Thank you, Christy. It's such a pleasure to join you tonight at the Talk of the Stacks. I'm particularly honored to be here to celebrate my dear friend, Resmaa Menakem. Now, Resmaa was among the first group of my friends that my partner and I made when we moved to Minneapolis over 30 years ago. And oddly enough, one of the memories that stands out to me at this time is how a bunch of us used to meet at a bookstore on 13th and Lake Street in South Minneapolis. We had formed a book club, and we'd study under the elders, reading and learning about our complicated history and working to understand better the impact that it had over who we were and all that we wanted to contribute to the world. So I'm excited and delighted to be here tonight. And I'll start by taking a moment now to formally introduce both of our special guests. Tonight's moderator, Lissa Jones, is a multi-talented culture coach and public speaker. She's a host of Black Market Reads, a podcast featuring today's most exciting Black literary voices. She's also the host of public affairs show Urban Agenda, which is broadcast weekly on KMOJ Radio. Now, tonight's guest of honor, Resmaa Menakem, is a healer, a longtime therapist, and a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in the healing of racialized trauma. He's also the founder of the Cultural Somatics Institute, where he's a cultural trauma navigator and a communal provocateur and coach. Now, Resmaa is best known as the author of the New York Times bestseller, My Grandmother's Hands, and as the originator and key advocate of somatic abolitionism, which is an embodied anti-racist practice of living and culture building. Now, just to give you a little bit more background, For 10 years, he co-hosted a radio show with Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison on KMOJ Radio in Minneapolis. And he also hosted his own show, Resmaa in the Morning, on KMOJ. And he's appeared on both the Oprah Show and the Dr. Phil Show, among many other TV shows, radio shows, and podcasts. Now, Resmaa has served as a director of counseling services for Tubman Family Alliance, the behavioral health director for African American Family Services, a domestic violence counselor for Wilder Foundation, and a social worker for Minneapolis Public Schools. Now, from 2011 to 2013, Resmaa was a community care counselor for civilian contractors in Afghanistan, managing the wellness and counseling services on 53 US military bases. Now, Resmaa joins us this evening to discuss his new book, The Quaking of America, an embodied guide to navigating our nation's upheaval and racial reckoning. So without further ado, it's my deep honor and pleasure to welcome moderator Lissa Jones and special guest Resmaa Menakem to Talk of the Stacks.
Oh my goodness. If there's ever anybody who you could want to introduce you, could you think of anybody better than her? Marvelous voice, excellent presence, just loving. Thank you so much, Sister Ayana, and welcome, Resmaa.
Thank you, sis. Thank you. You know, I've been thinking about this all week. I've been since last week. I'm looking forward to this.
Me too. I really thank you. And you know, they want to hear from you. So let's get right to it, brother. Let's talk about it.
Let's get crack-a-lackin'.
Let's get it crack-a-lackin'. You're a New York Times bestselling author, and I really do want to know how that feels. But my first question is, this is your second book, Resmaa. Why did you choose books to be your medium for teaching, in addition to the many other ways you teach? But why did you choose books? Why did you choose to write?
That's a great question. You know, I didn't. I didn't even know I was a writer. Like my mom is a PhD. She's a professor, and she kept asking me, "Well, when you going back to get your PhD?" I was like, "Hey, look, I got out of my master's degree by the skin of my teeth. I am not." And not going back, right? And so I just did social work, right? I was just doing social work, and then you know, after about 10, 15 years, I had a friend of mine that said to me, you know, you got a book, you know, you tell stories well, you should write a book, you should do this. And so I attempted to write something, and he is my agent now, but he said, when I sent it to him, he was like, that's crap. Like, who did you write this? And I said, yeah. And he goes, oh, that's not good. And I said, I told you it wasn't good. I told you I'm not a writer. And then he said this brilliant thing. He said, come over to my house and let's talk. So I went over there, and we started talking. He's not a Black man. He's not a therapist. So he would ask me questions that just regular people would ask me, right? Just let me talk. And then he recorded that on a digital recorder. And so so this is the way I write my books now, is that me and him talk, and then we record it on a digital recorder. We send it to a transcriptionist. She transcribes it, then she sends it back, and we edit it, and then we go back and forth on those types of. That's how I write. That's why my books sound like I'm talking, is because that's what's happening. And so that's how I write. I can't sit down and do this thing. I have to talk about it. I have to have some type of interaction with another human being. So that's how I do it. So I think it kind of chose me. Now I love writing. Now I love doing it, because I think what scared me was being able to transfer what was up here and what was being downloaded into me into this, right? That's what there was always like this sense that there is a gap between those two different pieces. And I think rather than going into it, a lot of times I just avoided it. But when I found that way of doing it, it's like, okay, I can do this.
You and I are always in sync, and it always trips me out because we've been together in so many podcasts and interviews, and you just did it again. My second question was going to be, what does your writing process look like? And was it different between My Grandmother's Hands and The Quaking of America? So recognizing that the process was similar, were there differences that you would identify?
Yeah. So I had a friend of mine that had read My Grandmother's Hands, and she said to me, she was like, "That's the most that Resmaa, it changed me. It changed my life. It helped me. It helped me not put the defect inside of me or in my people. It helped me understand that something happened and was continuing to happen to me." And then I said, and then I sent her Quaking. I sent her a galley copy of Quaking before it actually got published. And I said, just spend some time with it. Let me know what you think and stuff like that. So after about 2 months, 3 months, she called me and she says, "Resmaa." And I said, "Yeah." I was like, "Yeah." And she said, "Oh, give me a minute." And I said, "Did you finish reading it?" She said, "Yeah, yeah." And a large part of this list, a large part of my books are not just the reading. It takes 9 to 13 months to get through my book because the practices are the most important thing. The practices allow things to emerge that you didn't even know were there. And so she goes, "Resmaa," she said, you told me this was going to be a different tone." I said, "Yeah." And she said, "My grandmother's hands in some ways was like a warm blanket." She goes, "This book is like a dark alley." It's like and that was the desire. When she said that, I was like, "Yep, that's it." Because I wanted people to get the experience of this book, that this idea that these things that we're seeing are episodic and not structural, that there's actually peril. There's a possibility of peril, right? That's what I want to communicate in this book. And so the process for me that was different was that I was actually writing a different book. I was actually writing a book called Our Grandchildren's Souls. And it was going to be the follow-up to my grandma. It was how do you transfer legacy, embodied legacy, down to future generations without you being here, right? But then January 6th happened. And when January 6th happened, that shifted my whole thing. I was like, one of the things I know about America and Americans is that we get amnesia 2 weeks after the news cycle stops, right? And this was so important. I knew we were going to start not calling this a coup, right? I knew we were going to get to a place where we're going to say, seeing 6,000 white folks show up and pee and crap in the halls of the Capitol, I knew we were going to make excuses for that. I knew watching these people beat the heck out of 141 police officers, and most of those police officers never unholstered their weapon, tells you something about the power and the advantage of white supremacy, and being in a white body. And so what I wanted to do was make sure that the tonal quality of what we actually witnessed as a nation, I wanted to make sure that got communicated. And so that was the difference in the feel of it.
That helps me a lot. I really thank you, because there was a significant tonal shift. And I was, I think I was expecting a follow-up to My Grandmother's Hands. And, as the creator of cultural somatics, Resmaa, you define somatic abolitionism in part as a form of growing up. What do you mean?
Yeah. So white supremacy and white body supremacy in and of itself, in its essence, is immature. It is immature to create a whole structure in a whole country predicated on telling the difference between human beings and human capacity and emergence through pigmentation, right? That notion is just immature, right? And we've ensconced that immaturity in law, in academics, in the prison industrial complex, in the way that we relate to each other, in in the medical, right? That immaturity is woven into the structural piece. And so it makes it a lot harder for people to get at it, right? They think immaturity is the way that you have to behave, but in actuality, you can create a cultural basis of immaturity, and people over time will see that immaturity as standard, right? And so for me, when I'm talking about growing up, I'm saying there are things with regard to, like me and you, listen, we are descended. Me and you are descended, and many of the bodies that are on this call are descended from people who were systematically raped for 250 years. I mean, just think about that for a second. That we were legally raped for 250 years in order to create a product that was then raped for even, you know what I mean? Like that's how, and so white body supremacy at its essence for me is traumatic. But we don't talk about it in those ways. We don't talk about the trauma and how that trauma gets embedded in the body, right? And so for me, the growing up piece is really about America beginning to contend with the charge and the weight of race, and how the race question in this country really is a species question. It's always been a species question. 3/5 is a species question. You know what I mean? Like all of these pieces are species questions, and we forget that when we talk about quote unquote white supremacy. And because when you talk about white supremacy, a lot of times people go to a cognitive experience as opposed to an embodied experience. And so when I'm talking about growing up, I'm saying that there are sufferings edges that this country has been unwilling to get to when it comes to race. And if we are ever going to become a mature nation, it is going to be because we actually get to those edges and begin to work those edges and not act like our founding, like the quote unquote founding fathers is where we all started, right? So.
I know we are talking about the Quaking of America, but I'm so glad for the reps of my grandmother's hands in the Quaking of America so I can do this interview proper justice, because I find myself running into doing reps while you're talking, trying to just 250 years of continued trauma for the purpose of power and wealth.
Yeah.
Poor white bodies being used by elite white bodies is something you taught me about a while back. I think with January 6th particularly, that's something I'd like to call out. Will you teach us about that, Resmaa?
Yeah, so think about this. So, me and you have been friends for a long time. Hell, I used to work for you. And so, you
We used to work
know.
together, Resmaa.
So we know that when it comes to like addiction and trauma, or addiction and abuse and people trying to find ways around things, right? We know that many times if you drill down long enough, there's trauma, right? If you go down far enough, there's trauma. But what we've done is that we have only kind of compartmentalized that trauma in terms of a personal lived experience. And what I talk about in my work and in my training is what I call a hip lens or a hip understanding or a hip theory when it comes to understanding people's trauma. Is that there is the historical aspect of it. And I'm not talking about like doing a historical history. I'm talking about there is something that happens when people have been brutalized for hundreds of years or thousands of years that doesn't get resolved simply because you have another generation. As a matter of fact, the next generation is impacted by the nervous systems of the previous generation, right? Decontextualized though. The previous generation may have dealt with some type of trauma and they have some context for what that is. The preceding generations usually don't. And so therefore the trauma becomes decontextualized. So trauma, what I say is that trauma in a person over time, decontextualized, can look like personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family over time can look like family traits. Trauma decontextualized in the people over time can look like culture. And so I always start with the historical, the intergenerational, the persistent institutional stuff that continues to happen, specifically to bodies of culture, right? And then your own personal. And that's why a lot of times this stuff has more, it seems like it has more weight to it. It has more charge to it, more pressure to it. So when we watch something that happens to George Floyd, to a Black, brown, and indigenous body, what happens to us is that there's this confluence of the historical, the intergenerational, the persistent institutional, and our own personal traumas that show up. And so I forgot what your question was, but what was your question?
No, you did beautifully. You did beautifully.
Okay.
It was just
Okay.
sort of talking about the growing up
That's right.
of somatic.
Right. So these pieces around, what people forget is that when I was domestic violence, when I was working in domestic violence, one of the things that we knew was that people who are abused in the domestic violence situation, especially if they grow up in it, they don't just learn the victim side, they also learn the perpetrator side, right? So those that are victimized also perpetrate, right? And so one of the things that I learned is that when you look at white bodies, let me say, before whiteness, when you look at pale bodies, right? After the fall of the Roman Empire, many of those poor white bodies had a particular type of relationship with the king, right? Right? They were on the king's land, they were on royal land and stuff like that. There was a particular they were particularly dependent on the king's good mood or whatever it is. And there was a lot of brutality. Right after the fall of the Roman Empire was what we call the Middle or the Dark Ages, right? That lasted for 1,000 years of brutality, of turning white women into witches, of the Crusades, of the Inquisitions. Like all of those types of things happened for 1,000 years to white bodies, or to pale bodies. And I believe that 1,000 years allowed white bodies, that by the time elite white bodies offered them the chance to be something other than pale, they chose white with both hands. But I believe that a large part of that rage, a large part of that feeling persecuted, a large part of that, it goes way back to that era. And so in the 1600s, when rich landowners and plantation owners offered them the chance, offered poor pale bodies to be white, they said, yeah, because we know what the viciousness is like with elite white bodies. So yeah, we'll take some of that. And so that ushered in, to me, white body supremacy. And so until white bodies begin to develop a culture that can actually deal with that first off, I believe that it's going to take at least 9 to 20 generations before white bodies even know what's going on with race. I don't believe they have any concept. I don't believe they have any concept collectively when it comes to race, because they haven't had to. They haven't had to navigate the ravages of it, right? It's always cursory, right? When it's central in bodies of culture's lives, particularly Black women's lives.
Resmaa, I'm always taking notes. I'm trying to do the interview and take notes at the same time. I am so glad that they are recording this. The quaking is a prevention tool to me. It is a guide for preparation around building our collective capacity to stay with peril and possibility. I really want to explore this with you because I think about, given America's commitment to white supremacy and its countless binaries, can Americans hold two truths at once? I mean, are we talking about Frederick Douglass's wisdom?
Right. Right. No, and it's proven that that America is not conditioned to do that. Right. And let me explain why. Listen, me and you have known each other for a long time. And so if I came to you tomorrow, if after this interview was over and I came to you, I said, listen, I'm thinking about running, I'm thinking about doing a triathlon. I'm thinking about, and you say, well, like, how do you, like, what is that? And I said, well, you swim 25 miles, you run 27 miles, and then you bike, some miles. And I'm thinking about doing that tomorrow. And you like, Resmaa, man, you should do that. And then you start thinking, I had a friend of mine that used to do that. Or you start saying, I'll be there, brother, I'll be there, right? And we'd have that conversation. And then you turn to me and you say, like, do you know when you're gonna do it? Like, when you're thinking about doing it? And I looked at you with a straight face and I said, tomorrow. You'd go, have you run? Do you know how to swim? I go, no, I don't know how to swim. right? And then I say, you say, well, have you run? Have you like been running? No, I ain't been running. No, I've been running. And then he said, well, do you have a bike? Yes, I got my son's little tricycle. I'm gonna use my son's tricycle, right? And you'd be like, first of all, what's wrong with this damn fool? And then the second thing you would say is that you would know is that there's going to be a whole lot of pain in my future, right? Like, you know that I'm getting ready to put my body through something that it's wholly unconditioned to withstand, right? And I feel that same way about America's resolve when it comes to race. America is unconditioned to actually be able to hold liberation. We keep talking about liberation. We keep talking about the things that we can do to change. We keep talking about those pieces, but there is no conditioning. There is no tempering. America has been put through a mass miseducation when it comes to race. And what makes us think that we're going to get out of this by not creating a mass embodied re-education, right? There is no conditioning, and which in January 6th shows you the shape that America's in, right? So being able to hold two truths is impossible. The condition, America hasn't run a block yet when it comes to race, right? Let me just say this. When we talk about like DEI and stuff like that, DEI is really conditioned around keeping white people comfortable so they don't blow out a room when you can start talking about race, right? It's billions of dollar industry that is really about obfuscating the charge of race in order to keep white people in the room long enough to teach them a glossary term, right? And so my piece around and DEI, if you do DEI, that's fine. The DEI is not liberation work. It is not liberatory work. It is not culture building work, right? It is insight work that's designed that the center of it is white comfort first, right? And then maybe we can talk about equity or diversity or different things like that. But the centering is white comfort. And so for me, until America can begin, and particularly white America, can begin to think about how do we get in shape body to body, not book club to book club, not kale salad to kale salad, but body to body, and figure this thing out with each other. This fire that exists in white bodies, they have never dealt with. They have never dealt with that rage that exists because of how they were brutalized by elite white bodies. They never dealt with it, right? And that level is what you see when you watch January 6th. You see that rage, and they say things like Jews will not replace this and replacement theory and all of those pieces are really about the rage that white bodies have had because of the brutality at the hands of elite white bodies. Right, and that never got dealt with. And the conduit that they used in order to deal with it was my body and Black bodies and indigenous bodies.
Ooh, I hope that other people on this call have done their reps because this is so important. Resmaa, bodies of culture. I cannot tell you how deeply deep that is and how long it takes people to catch on. But once they do so, talk to me, Resmaa, bodies of culture. I dig it.
Yes, sis, something about people of color always bugged me. It always not bugged me in a cognitive sense. I would say people of color, and something in my lower belly would kink. It would always, and this is the piece around somatic abolitionism and paying attention and tempering and conditioning your body so you can begin to pick up things down the road as opposed to only when things are right up in your face, right? And one of the things that would happen for me is that people of color, something about it I experienced it as constricting. And so one of the things I know about constrictions is that when you stay with constriction long enough, it deepens the body's sense of discernment. And so I stayed with it, right? And one of the things that happened with people of color is that when I was doing the work around somatic abolitionism, I began to understand that part of what white body supremacy does is that it forces it disorients you. And your orientation is not more in your peoplehood, it's more than trying to navigate the upside down, right? And so you always are kind of off a little bit. And what I've discovered is that if you don't define the thing properly, that this orientation looks normal. So my basic the way I oriented myself is that I say we live in an age where the white body deems and has deemed itself the supreme standard by which all bodies' humanity shall be measured philosophically and structurally. If you don't understand just that one piece, everything else will disorient you, right? And so once I started there, I was able to say, okay, it gave me more room. It gave me more room to question and re-language things that gave me more room, right? And so bodies of culture for me was about, okay, one of the first things that happened to people, to indigenous people at the hands of white bodies and at the hands of white ferality, one of the first things that happened was a stripping of their language, right? Language is was one of the first things to differentiate one culture from another culture, right? So this piece around bodies of culture was my attempt of helping people give language to that reclaiming process, right? That would try to be spirit murdered out of me or spirit murdered out of indigenous people was my culture, right? And my culture it really is a representation of my humanity, right? And so that reclamation by using that term, bodies of culture, was a way to get at what happened to, if you are in a brown, black, or indigenous or Asian body, that being in this world, because it's global, being in this world is an attack on your humanity from before you come out of the womb, right? And so for me, body of culture was a way to say that thing that happened to your peoples actually happened to your peoples. And part of what we have to do is reclaim our humanity, not reclaim a color. We live in a structure that is predicated on this pigmentocracy, right? There is identity, but I'm not talking about identity. I'm talking about the body, a pigmentocracy that has been set up that suggests that the further you get away from whiteness, the more deviant you are from humanity.
I'm repping. I'm doing my reps. I'm doing my reps. I'm doing my reps, Resmaa. You know, when I think about it, when you're thinking about the DEI space, it's bodies, black and brown bodies and indigenous bodies and Asian bodies get called in to do the work and all the heavy lifting and the emotional invoicing centering on whiteness. But it's often then left to them to try to correct what is inherently wrong in the social construction of whiteness. So whose work is it to do, Resmaa, to prepare for a collective fight response what does it look like? If we were to prepare for a collective flight response, what does it look like?
So I just did a talk to the video game industry last week, and it was to DEI professionals in the video game industry, and that's a very new thing in the gaming profession. You know, most DEI professionals in the gaming industry have a 5-year or less history. Yeah, it's not a very long history. And so when I go there, I go into this room, and it's mostly Black, brown, indigenous, and Asian bodies that are the heads of these DEI pieces. These DEI pieces have been chronically underfunded, chronically overworked, right? And they become the kind of off ramp for white bodies to engage in white organizations to engage in liberation practices. They become an off-ramp, right? So all of the things. So here's what we want you to do. We're going to hire you as the chief operating DEI professional in this organization, and you have to be the mammy to the CEO, because you know he's fragile and he can't really tolerate race because he hasn't had to, or she hasn't had to, and you have to deal with the brutality that's been blown through the bodies of culture. So you're sandwiched in that piece, and what ends up happening is that the bodies of culture in those positions end up getting powerfully brutalized, and without a language to explain it, right? And it is not just a cognitive brutalization. It is a physical brutalization. We say things like microaggressions, but there's nothing micro about the aggressive and feral nature of America, right? In particular. And so these pieces around making sure that we understand the parameters of white body supremacy, and beginning to help people understand that when we're talking about DEI work, that is not the same as liberatory work, and people are getting brutalized. DEI professionals are getting brutalized, thinking that it is their job to shift 400 and 500 years of white plurality and brutality, right? And don't get me wrong, people get paid in those pieces. But what I've noticed is that the cost really is people's spirit and grounding and moorings, right? People in these professions, especially bodies of culture in these professions, don't get off because they go in and think that I am getting a chance to change culture. And what they find out is that they're not getting a chance to change culture. And so one of the things I would talk to them about is that you have to literally create something for your people outside of that. You are taking your genius and you are taking everything that you have and the beauty of what you bring, you take it and you try and put it into a structure that is predicated on white body supremacy. The moment that you do that, you must truncate your genius. That's what happens. That's the process. So if you're not building out here and building your peoplehood out here, at the same time you're resisting the seductive quality of white body supremacy, what will happen is that one of them will have to crack in half. Right? And so for me, when I'm talking to particularly bodies of culture in the DEI space that have these lofty titles, I really try and handle them like they're my brother or sister or a non-binary pronoun, that I'm trying to hold them because I know the brutality that they're experiencing. I know the brutality of exceptionalism when you're in an Asian body or Black body, an indigenous body. I know it weathers and withers you. So a large part of my work when I'm doing these practices is saying that is not your job. Your liberatory job, that's over here. This stuff, that's not your job. That's white folks' job. You're trying to pick up 400 years of work, and you have to condition yourself to be clear about it, because our bodies have been conditioned around white deference so much that when white people get the slightest bit uncomfortable, we start to lean into them. We have been conditioned around that, and they have been conditioned around us being deferential.
Woo. We had one civil war. Now they say we're going to have another one. What say you, Resmaa?
Listen, Roe versus Wade, the overturning of Roe versus Wade started happening the moment that Roe versus Wade went through. See, this is what I mean. We have such an episodic understanding of when things happen that we don't connect Roe versus Wade to Emmett Till to the Black Panther Party, the Black Panther Party to Frederick Douglass to January 6th. You're like, we don't. There is no tapestry for us, right? And so what you saw on January 6th was it's what so in my book I talk about this thing called plantation ethos and plantation ethics. The primary organizing structure of this country has never been the Constitution. It has never been the Declaration of Independence. It has never been even religion. The primary organizing institution of this country has always been the plantation. Always been the plantation. It organized America before America was America. If you're talking about the Constitution, you're talking about you're talking about at least 200 years before the organizing structure got set up. The plantation, listen, pause on this for a second, sis. The plantation organized white people. Think about that. Think about what I'm saying. You know what I'm saying. The plantation organized the social distance, organized who was worthy. It organized who shall be put upon. It organized, based on pigmentation, that organized white people. Not black people, white people. And so when you watch this genuflect of white women, more white women voting for Trump the second time than the first time, you're watching plantation ethos and ethics at play. When you watch people say, even quote unquote good liberals say things like, Trump was a horrible person, but you know, he did some good things, right? Like those pieces, right? Like this idea of having a strong white man who has dominion over all bodies, right? That is a throwback to the plantation for the organization of white bodies. That has never been dealt with. That has never been dealt with. And so for me, the idea that the world, that we're going to have another civil war, I think is not the right question. I think the right question is, why is it that it takes, like right now, if you ask most white bodies have totally forgot that what they saw on TV was an attempted coup. You know what I mean? That was an attempted coup with murder and mayhem, right? But if you ask most people who go to Costco right now whether or not they thought it was a coup, most people don't have that. That did not change. Most white bodies who saw that happen did not go and say, you know what, I need to create a safety plan for me and my family. You know, I need to learn more about the history of the United States. You know, I need to go take a self-defense course. You know, I need to go get weapons trained. You know, that did not occur in mass, right? And so what that does is set up for the next thing to happen, and the next thing to happen, and the next thing to happen. And so it is not if we're going to have a civil war or some type of thing, it's when.
You know, Resmaa, I wish, as always, my friend, though I know I can talk to you whenever you're around, but I wish I could talk to you longer. I only have a couple of minutes before I need to turn it back to Rob. I want to say thank you for centering on embodied gratitude for Black women. Can you give us 2 minutes on why?
Yeah. That chapter came out of watching Black women organize, particularly the Democratic Party, and then every time get cast aside as if they're nothing. Watching Black women be the most ardent supporters of the Democratic Party. And every time we want to get the Emmett Till Act passed, every time we want to get the George Floyd Justice Policing Act passed, every time we want to get a Voting Rights Act passed named after John Lewis, every time there's Black women that's pushing that forward. And the Democratic Party does not respect Black women because the whole construct is that Black women, listen to me, Black when creation decided there was going to be an expression of humanness on this planet, it decided that that expression of humanness on this planet was going to be a Black woman. First representation. And all of us come through that, right? For me, my work really is about taking what has been flipped upside down as it relates to Black women, as it relates to African women, and turning it right side up. There is nobody on this call right now who doesn't have the mitochondria of an African woman somewhere in them, right? This idea of the Black woman being the way through this thing, for me, is why I wrote that chapter. I wanted to at least make an attempt to right-size this and get people talking about the beauty and the role and the positioning of Black women. Plus, I wanted to write it for my wife. I wanted to write it for you. I wanted to write it for those Black women that love me and have nurtured me since, since before I came on the planet. And so that was my ode to Black women.
Then on behalf of me and all the Black women who love you, who are so lucky to love you, thank you, Resmaa Menakem. And thank you for the Quaking of America. You have always been and continue to be a hero to me. It is now, sadly, time for me to wrap it up, but it's my privilege to bring back Rob Gowdy with the Talk of the Stacks. Thank you to the Talk of the Stacks. Thank you, Brother Resmaa.
Love you, sis.
I love you.
Thank you so much, Lissa, for that incredible guidance through this conversation. Thank you, Resmaa, for your wisdom and for your truth and for sharing all of this with our audience here at Talk of the Stacks. My name is Rob Gowdy. I'm the events director for Friends of the Library, and it's my pleasure to join the conversation tonight to lead the audience Q&A portion of the program. So if you haven't yet added your question for Resmaa, you can do so by clicking the Q&A icon on the bottom center of the screen. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. Going back to the beginning of the conversation about maturity, a question from Sharon. Do you have suggestions for teaching or supporting maturity in all people of America? How can our policies or expectations for others encourage maturity?
You can't teach it. You have to grow it. It has to emerge from a cultural container that you set first. Those types of questions are really about fixing something and correcting something, right? There's this concept that I believe revolves around fixers and builders, right? Fixers are important, but builders think about this in terms of foundations, right? How do we create a foundation so what we want to have happen can actually emerge, right? Not how do we go fix this particular thing so it can cure some ill. I'm cool with that. But what I'm saying is that these questions around how do we teach and how do we do this misses what I said earlier around conditioning. We are not conditioned to teach liberation. We are not conditioned to be able to understand the vibratory aspects of liberation, the meaning-making aspects of the sensate aspects of liberation. But we want to go out and teach people to be better and be nice. We think niceness and kindness is a substitute for liberation work, and it is not.
It reminds me a little, Resmaa, of something you'd said on a recent podcast about how people think that we can think our way out of this problem, but
right.
It's a matter of being.
It's
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, the being really is. So here's what I've been doing this work for 40 years. Here's one of the things that I've realized is that white bodies hate being in a room with other white bodies talking about race. Like to get white bodies to get into a room with each other and talk about race, and then say to each other, I am going to commit to you for the rest of my life You are either going to bury me or I'm going to bury you in trying to create a living, embodied anti-racist culture. Not tips. That would involve developing the capacity to be with each other, not teach each other, not eat with each other, not a book club with each other, be with each other, because the being forces an intimacy that fixing does not.
Another
Okay.
follow-up that's related to this, and I think this will be the last time we ask these questions that are centered a little more on whiteness. A question from DJ, where do we begin? And Annette, how do you recommend that white bodies do the book, The Quaking of America? Do you read it as groups, both genders, bodies of culture, and white bodies together? What recommendations for white bodies approaching this text?
Let me say this to white bodies. Leave bodies of culture alone. Don't ask them to come and teach you about this stuff. Leave them alone, and particularly leave women bodies of culture together, and then more specifically, leave Black women's bodies alone when it comes to this. Do not do this cross-culturally, and start with my grandmother's hands. Okay, start with that, because that will allow you to at least get to some sense of things. And don't look for numbers. If 25 show up, that's not a success. Your people that you are going to do this work with, your people are not the people you start with, it's the people you end with. It's the 3 that are left that keep coming back because they want to create something more generative, right? And so for me, do not do it cross-culturally. I would also say, don't go into it looking at it as a book club, right? If you want some foundational pieces, take my at resmaa.com, take my foundations in somatic abolitionism. That can, if you want to do that, that can give you some basis. But do the practices with other white bodies, learning and working and seeing what comes up as you do it. Right. So that's the way I suggest it. So if you're going to not listen to what I'm saying and go ahead and start the Quaking of America, don't do it cross-culturally.
We have a question that swings on a bit of a different direction here from Michaela. When your body experiences racial trauma, how does it evolve beyond resiliency?
Ooh. So I want to take that word resiliency and just work with it for a second. When I think about my people and the joy and the love and the laughter and the leaning into softer things, right? I think about how particularly this country tried to extinguish that, and it's still there, and it shines and it emerges. I think about how that trauma is energy. Trauma is a thwarting energy. It thwarts and constricts emergence, right? That it literally tries to constrict it. It doesn't kill it, because resource is primary, right? And so for me, I always think about how, as I work with bodies of culture, working with the traumatic effects of white body supremacy. One of the things that I see that beautifully emerges is when I see bodies of culture start to begin to tie into that resource. Like as they do their reps, you start to see things and questions begin to emerge and come up through, not because you're growing something new, it's because it was always there. That emergence and that all we have to do is work over time, loosening the grip of the thwarting energy of trauma, and the things start to sprout. And so for me, beyond resilience is really a tying back into, a binding to, a remembering to creation itself.
I, like Lissa, I'm gonna have to do my reps on that. That's just, it's kind of
Yeah.
mind-blowing. Thank you.
Yeah.
Dipping back into history, which was mentioned earlier in the conversation, this question's from Scott. You spoke of white American bodies carrying intergenerational and historical trauma that has remained unaddressed since the Middle Ages. Is that traumatic energy now being expressed by the political far right, which
Yes.
seems to desire violent medieval rule by an absolute monarch?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But I don't want to take the far right and quote unquote good white people or progressives out of it, right? You know, good white people would love to love declarations of independence from other white people, right? And they want to be the kind of exception. I get it. But whenever I have a white body that says to me, I'm an ally, the first question that pops into my brain is, how would I know that if you hadn't have told me? Like, who are the people that you're creating a living embodied anti-racist culture with? Don't tell me that you read my grandmother's hands. Don't tell me that you read White Fragility. Don't tell me that you did I have no interest in that, right? And so what I'm seeing happening is, and this is what I talk about in the Quaking of America, is this perfect kind of dovetail that happens, and it's the rage of the far right. Right, it's the rage, and what's happened is that the far right and the right, or whatever you want to call it, has given a sense of unencumberedness to white bodies. Right, many white bodies have a sense of being unencumbered when it comes to issues of race, right? And but that perfectly dovetails with the fecklessness and the unseriousness of progressives, right? Progressives see things as episodes, not as structural. They may talk structurally, but they haven't built a structure, a living embodied anti-racist culture and structure, right? So what ends up happening is that the fecklessness of the progressives and the brutality of the Republicans have a perfect dovetail, right? And that's why people have a sense that I don't know if this can be fixed. I don't know if this could be taken care of. I don't know what to do, right? And that's because we continue to look at it as episodes and how to fix it, as opposed to how do we grow a living embodied anti-racist culture so we don't pass this brutality down to our children's children.
Our next question from Gina takes off in a different direction, but I think it's really worth asking. Your concept of the plantation as the structure that organized white supremacy in the US really hit me. Is there more you could say about this? I've been researching plantations with the US Black Heritage Project on WikiTree and I would like you to share more of what you have to say about it.
Absolutely. So I don't say white supremacy. I say white body supremacy, because if you take the body out when I'm talking about plantations, now all of a sudden white supremacy becomes this kind of cognitive exercise, right? The reason why I say white body supremacy is because the white body deems and has deemed itself the supreme standard by which all bodies' humanity shall be measured structurally and philosophically. I'm not talking about individual white people. I'm not talking about your uncle. I'm not talking about your daddy that marched with Martin Luther King on the 7th day of June. I'm not talking about the little Guatemalan child that you adopted, right? And you saved from a life, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that there has been when you look at the plantation, like, let me say it a different way. The 13 colonies, right? Colonies are filled with what? Colonized people. We never talk about that. We never talk about the 13 colonies, and we never talk about the fact that most of the colonies were filled with white people that were fleeing something. We never talk about that fleeing, right? Most of the white bodies on this call are descended from white bodies that were fleeing something. That fleeingness never got dealt with. And so when I'm talking about what organized those people in those colonized people in those 13 colonies, what organized them to a large extent was the plantation. The plantation gave them jobs, gave them direction, gave them understanding for how to moor themselves in the world. That has never been dealt with among white people. The idea that the plantation, and when I say plantation, I'm not just talking about the South, because remember, the North also benefited mightily from the cotton in the South, right? The factories. There was a reason why it was called King Cotton. The reason it was called for some of our Caribbean brothers and sisters, sugar cane and you know what I mean, like dyes and all that different type of stuff. These pieces never got dealt with among white bodies, and the plantation organized the way that they saw success. Let me just say this last piece. The king-serf relationship, the way that I believe white bodies were conditioned around that relationship of the king-serf is a direct alignment with the owners of plantations. And that idea that the way to freedom is to emulate the person who owned the plantation, that the unencumberedness is freedom, right? And so I believe most poor white bodies think that, or have a sense collectively that freedom is to be unencumbered to do anything that I want to do to whoever I want to do it to. And that's their idea of freedom. And so that's what I mean about the organizing structure. We have to slow it down so we can begin to look at, it's obvious what the plantation did to people that look like me, right? It's less obvious what the plantation actually did to white bodies in terms of their incessant need to be advantaged based on pigmentation.
Well, we have time for one more question, but before we do, I do have to share one reminder. If you have not yet read The Quaking of America, and you absolutely should, we're going to ask that you please consider clicking the link in the chat and making your purchase through.
You went out, Rob, you went out. You muted, Rob. Okay.
Thank you, Resmaa. I had a very nice speech. You just missed it. I was just saying that we do have time for one more question. And before that, I do want to let everyone know that if you haven't purchased your copy of The Quaking of America yet, you can do so through our bookseller partner, Moon Palace Books, by clicking the link in the chat.
I love Moon Palace.
We love Moon Palace, and we love it when you shop local, because when you do that, you're helping our local literary community to thrive. So pick up that copy of Quaking of America through Moon Palace. And with that, let's move on to our one final question here. This is from Umar. How can we as bodies of culture build ourselves an empowered and thriving community? What do we need to do to heal ourselves?
Oh, Umar, beautiful question. Okay. So one of the things that happens when you're a body of culture and you are living in this global world, because white body supremacy is global, right? One of the things that happens is that you ingest, I heard this poet say, white poet say one time for white bodies, that white body supremacy is not the shark, it's the water, right? And so this idea that we're so busy looking for the white body supremacy shark that we forget that we're steeped in the water of it, right? And that we've ingested those pieces also. We've ingested pieces around patriarchy. We've ingested pieces around colorism. We've ingested pieces around blood quantum. We've ingested, right? So as bodies of culture, we've ingested. We are not advantaged by, and we did not create it. we have ingested it. And so part of our work in terms of reclamation, in terms of reclaiming, is to begin to do that work with each other. There's so much grief in there. There's so much joy in there. There's so much room in there. There's so much terror in there that we have to do that with each other's bodies slowly. And watch each other, witness each other, and observe each other as we go through the process, both individually and communally. This is not an individual endeavor. What happened to my people, did not happen to my people individually. It happened to my people communally. Hanging my people from bridges was done to instill terror into those that were living. That terror impacts the nervous system, the brain architecture, the cardiovascular system, the reproductive system. We have to be gentle with ourselves and slow with ourselves, so what needs to emerge in terms of capacity can.
And with that answer, we bring tonight's program to a close. Thank you so much, Resmaa, for your time tonight, for your thoughts, for your ideas. We are better for having heard them. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
And I do just have one more thought to share before we wrap up the program. If you enjoyed tonight's program and you are interested in joining us for the next Talk of the Stacks, it's coming up on August 16th and features Pulitzer honorees in poetry, Diane Seuss and Mai Vang. So you can register for that event by clicking the link in the chat. You can also order that copy of Resmaa's book. You can also learn more about the library's Marianne Key Book Club. Before I forget it, Alyssa Jones, thank you so much for your incredible interview tonight. We're always happy to have you with us at Talk of the Stacks. Thanks again, Resmaa. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope to see you next time. Have a great night.